Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. There comes a moment when the truth stops knocking and starts kicking doors down. That's the point you're standing in right now. The moment where people who once acted like they didn't need you suddenly want a full investigation, a confession, and a TED Talk explaining why their world is falling apart. And the funniest part? They're not looking for the truth out of love or concern. No, they're looking for it because your absence is exposing things their ego can't keep hidden anymore. Psychologists have actually found that people fear being found out more than they fear being wrong. And that's exactly why they're begging someone, anyone, to come tell you the truth. Not your truth, their version. The version that makes them look like a misunderstood saint, not the architect of their own chaos. Your growth is making them sweat. Your peace is making them paranoid. Your silence, the same silence they once mocked, now feels like someone pulled the batteries out of their control panel. They wish they could rewind time, not because they miss you, but because they miss the version of themselves they looked like when you were standing beside them. Now they want explanations, clarity, closure, a meeting, an apology circle, all the things they never offered you. They want someone to talk to you on their behalf because they can't face the consequences of their own behavior. It's funny how people become philosophers when their comfort is threatened. Suddenly they want to discuss, revisit, reevaluate, and reconsider. Someone even says, "Let's all sit down and sort this out," like you're supposed to be the customer service desk for their damaged self-image. But here's the twist nobody warned them about. Nothing can save them from the truth they created. Not a friend, not a middleman, not a long message, not a rehearsed apology. They're not praying for peace. They're praying for protection from the story finally catching up with them. And tonight, we're talking about exactly that. The moment the chosen ones stop explaining, and the world starts revealing what people hoped you'd never see. Number 1, they want you to speak because your absence exposes their guilt. When people start begging for the truth, they're rarely asking because they want clarity. They're asking because something inside them has been disturbed, and your silence is the trigger. Your absence is not quiet to them. It's loud, uncomfortable, and revealing. It forces them to confront themselves, and that's exactly what they've spent years avoiding. The moment you stop explaining, they realize how many explanations they actually needed to give. Suddenly, every unfinished conversation becomes a mirror reflecting their behavior, and that guilt begins to multiply in places they thought were safely hidden. Your absence turns into a spotlight, not because you intended it, but because they know what they did when no one was watching. They know the roles they played, the things they said, and the way they treated you when they believed you had no other options. They wanted you to speak only when it made them comfortable. They wanted you to stay quiet when the truth didn't serve their narrative. But now, with you gone, the truth has no leash. That's what terrifies them. People who have nothing to hide never panic about silence. It's only the guilty ones who start digging for explanations the moment you stop talking. They want you to speak so they can shape your words, twist your meaning, and soften their own image. If you speak, they get the chance to challenge you or redirect the blame. But when you stay silent, they're stuck alone with their conscience, and for some people, that's the most dangerous room they could be left in. They fear what your silence implies. They fear what you might eventually say. They fear what you've already understood. Your absence exposes the truth they were hoping would stay buried. It forces them to see themselves without the comfort of denial. And deep down, they know it isn't your voice that threatens them. It's what your silence confirms. Number 2, they beg for answers. Because they can't live with the version of themselves you've seen. When someone who once treated you carelessly suddenly wants explanations, it's not about you at all. It's about the panic rising inside them. You saw something they never planned to show. Maybe it was their insecurity, maybe their selfishness, maybe their lack of emotional honesty. Whatever it was, it broke the illusion they worked so hard to maintain, and now they can't stand living with the version of themselves that you witnessed without filters, without performance, without the mask they wear for everyone else. It's easy to act decent when people only see the highlight reel. It's easy to look loyal when no one is checking the deleted scenes. But when someone has seen the real cuts, the impatience, the disrespect, the half-truths, the excuses, the way they only show up when it benefits them, that person stops being impressed, and that enrages people more than you'd expect, not because they miss you, but because they miss being admired by you. They miss being believed in. They miss being seen as better than they actually behave. So they ask for the truth, but it's not your truth they're after. They want reassurance that their worst moment wasn't seen. They want absolution without accountability. They want you to tell them that what you saw wasn't really what it was. They want to rewrite their own character through your lips because they can't rewrite it alone. The uncomfortable part for them is this: you can't unsee honesty. You can't forget a pattern just because someone suddenly wants to talk nicely. You can't pretend that the cracks you saw were just shadows, and they know that. That's why their tone becomes urgent. Their messages get longer. Their excuses get louder. They're not chasing closure. They're chasing a version of themselves that never existed outside their imagination. Your silence destroys that fantasy without saying a word. It forces them to sit with the truth they created through their actions. And that is something most people can't handle for even 5 minutes, let alone a lifetime. In the end, their desperation isn't about understanding you. It's about escaping the discomfort of understanding themselves. And no explanation you give will ever save them from that. Number 3, they want you back because you were their moral alibi. Some people don't hold on to you because they love you. They hold on because you make them look like someone worth loving. Your presence acts like a stamp of credibility on their character. When you stand beside them, they seem kinder, wiser, more grounded, more trustworthy than they actually behave. And when you walk away, that illusion collapses faster than they can patch it with excuses. They want you back not to repair the bond, but to repair their reputation in their own mind and in the minds of others. You were their moral alibi, the silent proof that, hey, I can't be that bad, someone like them stayed with me. When you leave, it exposes something they can't afford to admit, even to themselves. Maybe the problem wasn't you. Maybe it was them all along. This is why they suddenly get dramatic when you stop engaging. They write long messages. They pull friends into the conversation. They invent misunderstandings. They apologize without really apologizing. What they're actually fighting to preserve is not the relationship. It's the story they've been telling about who they are. And you're the one person who saw through it. When you were there, you absorbed their rough edges without making a public scene. You gave them chances, you gave them grace, you gave them time. And they interpreted that kindness as validation. They thought it meant they were improving or worth fighting for when, in truth, it meant you were patient and perceptive. When you stop giving them that moral cover, they feel naked, not emotionally, socially, identity-wise. People like that can't stand being seen for what they actually do when no one is applauding. They can't stand being confronted, even indirectly, with their own inconsistency. Your exit forces are reckoning they've been dodging since day one. So they beg for you to come back because your presence restores a version of them they wish were real. They aren't chasing love or companionship. They're chasing relevance, validation, and a clean conscience they never earned. The truth is simple. When someone needs you to stay in order to look good, they were never good to begin with. And no amount of begging changes that. When you stop being their moral alibi, you stop being their responsibility. And that is exactly what scares them the most. Number 4, they need you to explain yourself so they can feel like the victim. When someone demands that you speak, justify, or clear the air, It's rarely about understanding. It's about rewriting the story so they can slip back into the role they're most comfortable playing. The victim. If you explain yourself, they get something to twist, something to dispute, something to turn against you, until suddenly you're the one apologizing for feeling hurt, for leaving, for protecting yourself. That's the game. Not truth, not closure, but control. People who can't sit with responsibility will do anything to dodge it. They'll frame your boundaries as coldness, your silence as hostility, your growth as rejection. They'll take a sentence and stretch it until it snaps back on you like a rubber band. They want you to talk because talking gives them ammunition they can't get when you're quiet. When you stay silent, they are left alone with their own choices, and that is terrifying to someone who has built their identity on deflection. Silence forces honesty. Silence forces accountability. Silence forces them to confront the fact that no one is coming to save them from themselves. The moment you start explaining, they breathe again, because now it's a debate, not a confession. Now it's two sides, not one truth. Now they can cry, gesture, appeal to sympathy, rewrite, rephrase, and repackage their behavior until it looks almost understandable, almost forgivable, almost like they didn't cause the very pain they're now performing. But you leaving and refusing to perform for them destroys the performance entirely. Without your voice, they can't sculpt a narrative that paints them as misunderstood or mistreated. Without your participation, their script collapses. And that collapse is exactly what they're unwilling to face. What they want is not understanding. They want absolution without change. What they want is not clarity. They want comfort. What they want is not truth. They want a storyline where they can feel righteous even when their actions say otherwise. When you stop explaining, you stop feeding a cycle that was never meant to heal anything. You stop giving them a stage on which to rewrite their own mistakes as someone else's fault. And that is why they beg. Not because they want the truth, because they can't survive it. Number 5, they're not seeking closure, they're seeking control. When someone insists that you owe them closure, what they're really saying is that they can't stand losing control of the story. Closure is a comforting word, but it's usually a mask. What they want is not peace, it's power. They want to pull you back into a conversation where they can shape the meaning, soften the impact, or shift the blame until they no longer have to sit with the consequences of their own actions. Closure is something you give yourself, not something someone demands from you like it's a receipt after a bad purchase. But when people can't accept that a situation is over, they invent this moral obligation because it keeps you orbiting them just long enough for them to breathe again. As long as you're talking, explaining, responding, you're still on their chessboard, and they're still moving pieces. They pretend it's about understanding, but it's really about resetting the emotional balance back in their favor. They want to hear your reasons not because they respect them, but because they want to dissect them, minimize them, and convince themselves they were never really at fault. In their mind, closure isn't an ending. It's a negotiation where they try to walk away feeling like they didn't do that bad. When you refuse to play, they panic. Not because they miss you, but because they miss influence. When you stop answering, they can't redirect the conversation, can't rewrite the timeline, can't present themselves as the wounded party in need of understanding. Silence cuts off their favorite tool, the ability to control how their behavior is interpreted. People who chase closure often want a final scene where they can perform remorse without committing to change, where they can say, "I get it now," without actually getting it, where they can feel like they've done something meaningful without doing anything different. But closure isn't a performance, and it isn't something you hand out to calm someone else's anxiety. Closure is truth meeting acceptance. And acceptance can't be forced, and it can't be negotiated. When you step away and refuse to justify yourself, You take back the narrative they've been gripping like a life raft. You remind them that control is not something they get to demand. And that is the real reason they chase it. Because losing control feels like losing themselves. Number 6, your growth is the confession. They'll never say out loud. When you start improving, healing, building, rising, whatever shape that takes, it hits certain people harder than any argument ever could. Your growth becomes a mirror they can't turn away from, and in that reflection, they see the confession they'd rather swallow than admit. You were too much for them, too aware for them, too steady for them, and they never matched it. They'll never say it plainly, so your progress says it for them. Growth isn't loud, but it's devastating to someone who benefited from keeping you small or confused. When you stop shrinking yourself, when you stop tolerating disrespect, when you stop explaining your worth to people who never cared to understand it, it exposes something they spent years denying, that they weren't capable of meeting you at your actual level. People who like being the center of someone's emotional world can't stand losing that gravity. Your progress pulls away, and suddenly they feel weightless, insignificant, sidelined in a story they thought they were writing. They can't admit that your improvement shows their own stagnation, because that would require honesty, and honesty, for some people, feels like stepping into freezing water, so they stay quiet, or they act offended, or they pretend they don't care. But their discomfort is louder than all of it, because deep down, they know something they can't articulate. If you can grow without them, then their presence wasn't as necessary as they believed. If you can heal without their permission, then their influence was not the medicine they thought it was. If you can succeed without their support, then their importance was self-made, not earned. Your growth is the confession they can't voice because it would require one simple sentence they're unable to say, "I wasn't enough for you." Instead, they watch you rise and feel a stirring they mistake for jealousy or nostalgia or irritation, when it's really just the truth finally catching up. What they never admit is this: you leaving gave you the space to become someone they could never have handled, because it takes courage and discipline to grow, two qualities they never invested in. So keep growing, because every step you take forward forces them to confront a reality they've been dodging from the beginning. And that silent confession, it's more telling than any apology they'll never make. Number 7, they're terrified. You'll tell the truth to the right people. When someone suddenly wants you to talk, explain, meet, or clear things up, it's rarely about emotional closure, and almost always about damage control. What they're really afraid of isn't your voice. It's the audience your voice might eventually reach. They can handle you being upset. They can't handle you being honest in front of people whose opinions actually matter to them. Every person keeps a version of themselves for public consumption and another version for private convenience. Most people can live comfortably with that split. But when you've seen the private version and walked away, they realize there's a witness. Not a loud witness, not a dramatic witness, just a credible one. And credibility is something they can't afford to lose. They know the truth isn't violent. It doesn't need shouting, threats, or exposé posts. It just needs to be told plainly, and suddenly their carefully built narrative develops cracks that can't be patched with excuses. They're not afraid of you being angry. They're afraid of you being believable. So they plead. They bargain. They bring intermediaries. They apologize in vague terms. They act like they're worried about your feelings when they're really worried about theirs, their social image, their relationships, their influence, their comfort. They want to make sure you stay silent, not because silence is kindness, but because silence is safety for them. The truth has a strange power. It doesn't have to be dramatic to undo someone's lies. One calm sentence from the right person can rewrite years of character in the minds of those who thought they knew everything. And they know you're capable of that, because you saw what they hid, and you're grounded enough not to exaggerate it. Maybe they can't imagine you ever speaking out, Maybe they hope you'll just get tired and move on. But hope is a thin blanket when you're sitting on a pile of unaddressed mistakes. What they can't stand is the possibility, even the faint possibility, that someone might hear a version of them they can't defend, can't spin, can't charm away. So they chase you not out of love, not out of remorse, not out of longing. They chase you out of fear. Fear that the truth, told by someone who actually knows it, might finally do what they never could, expose them without cruelty, without anger, without drama. And that is the one thing they can't survive. Number 8, they expected you to collapse without them, and that lie is killing them. Some people stay comfortable only when they can convince themselves that you can't survive without their presence. They build their ego on the fantasy that they are the anchor in your storm, the support in your weakness, the indispensable character in your story. They don't say it out loud, but they behave like it every time they disrespect you and expect you to stay. Every time they take more than they give, every time they assume you'll fold because they did. So when you don't collapse, when you rise instead, it shatters something inside them they never prepared to face. Your stability without them is proof that their importance was imagined, their influence exaggerated, their role in your life inflated until it became a lie they started believing. Watch how their tone changes when they realize you're fine. Better even. The sudden defensiveness, the jealousy disguised as concern, the "I thought you'd be struggling" disguised as casual conversation. They can't admit it, but it hurts. Because deep down, they weren't just hoping you'd stay, they were hoping you'd fail without them, not out of malice, but out of insecurity so loud it drowned out any genuine care. When you thrive, you expose the truth they spent years dodging. You were carrying yourself long before they ever showed up. Your strength wasn't borrowed, your progress wasn't sponsored, your resilience wasn't conditional on their presence. And now they have to sit with that reality like a stone in their shoe. People like that can't stand being irrelevant, and nothing makes them feel irrelevant faster than watching the person they underestimated build a life they can't touch or influence anymore. Their panic isn't about losing you. It's about losing the story they told themselves to feel worthy. Their desperation isn't love. It's fear that they were never as necessary as they believed. When you keep moving forward, when you stop looking back, when you refuse to validate a fiction, you do something they were never taught how to do. You choose yourself without apology. And that, more than any explanation, any confrontation, any silence, is what destroys their narrative completely. Because when you don't collapse without them, they have to admit they never mattered as much as they thought. Number 9, they know you saw through the role they were pretending to play. Every person walks around with a performance ready, a version of themselves designed for applause, comfort, or advantage. Most people get away with it because few take the time to look beneath the surface, and even fewer care enough to call it out by simply stepping away. But when someone like you sees through the role, it rattles them in a way no argument ever could. You saw the mismatch between their words and their choices. You saw how their kindness came with conditions, how their loyalty came with limits, how their confidence came with insecurity disguised as superiority. You saw the cracks in the character they were selling, not because you were judging, but because you were paying attention. And attention is something people can't fake their way through forever. When someone realizes you've seen the real structure beneath the polished facade, it feels like being caught in a costume they can't take off fast enough. They can't run from it because you're not attacking them. You're simply no longer impressed. And that is far more dangerous to their ego than any insult. People can handle conflict. They can't handle clarity. When you stop buying into the performance, you expose how much of their identity relied on applause they never earned. When you stop reacting to their charm, you reveal how hollow it was. When you stop apologizing for their mistakes, you show how entitled they became. They know you saw it because their behavior changes around you, even after you're gone. They overcompensate. They perform harder for everyone else. They get defensive for no reason. They become louder, sweeter, colder, stranger, anything to regain a control they no longer have. The truth is simple. You weren't just another audience member. You were someone who could read the script while watching the actor forget their lines. And that terrifies people. Not because you're powerful, but because you're perceptive. You don't need to expose them. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to explain anything. All you have to do is walk away, and suddenly the character they spent years crafting has nowhere left to hide. That's why they chase explanations, apologies, conversations, anything, because they know deep down you already saw the truth they never meant to show. Number 10, they want you to break your silence, because it forces you to re-enter their world. When someone begs you to speak, to explain, to meet, to talk just once, it's never about resolving anything. It's about pulling you back into a space you already outgrew. Your silence isn't hurting them because it's cold. It's hurting them because it's effective. It stops their world from revolving around you, and that loss is unbearable for people who built their sense of importance on proximity to you. When you respond, even for a moment, you validate their narrative that you still belong in their orbit. You reassure them that they still have access to your thoughts, your emotions, your attention, all the things they treated like resources they didn't have to earn. Your words, even gentle ones, open a door they weren't meant to walk through again. That's why they push so hard. Not because they need clarity, but because they need connection on their terms. When you stay silent, they have to sit with a reality they cannot negotiate. You don't owe them presence, affection, or explanation. And for people who equate being heard with being worthy, that realization feels like losing oxygen. Breaking your silence does something deeper than soothe them. It resets the dynamic. It re-establishes the rhythm where they can charm, deflect, minimize, apologize, or emotionalize until you forget why you left in the first place. They know this pattern because they created it, and they know how easy it is for you to be drawn back if you give them even a sliver of access. But silence changes the rules. Silence says you're no longer participating in a game that cost you more than it ever gave back. Silence says you're choosing clarity over chaos, peace over performance, self-respect over familiarity. And that is something they cannot imitate or request without revealing their dependence on you. When they plead for you to talk, they're really pleading for you to step back into a world where their influence still counts, where their presence still matters, where their approval still has weight. Your refusal isn't cruelty, it's liberation. It's the quiet announcement that you have built a life beyond their reach, and they no longer get to write chapters in it. That is what terrifies them, because once you stop returning to their world, they have to learn how to stand in their own. Number 11, they're hoping your truth will be soft enough to save their reputation. When people chase you for the truth, what they actually want is a version of it that won't cost them anything. They're not asking for honesty. They're asking for mercy. They want you to package your experience in a way that keeps their image intact, their friendships untouched, their pride safe, and their excuses believable. But here's the problem. Truth isn't something you can soften without turning it into something else entirely. Truth isn't a pillow you fluff for someone who didn't bother to treat you gently when it mattered. Truth is a mirror, and mirrors don't get edited for the comfort of the person staring into them. When they plead for you to explain, they're hoping you'll choose kindness over accuracy, silence over clarity, or diplomacy over reality. They want a story they can hold up in public and say, "See, I'm not that bad." They want to walk away feeling vindicated even when their actions were anything but. You can hear it in the way they speak. "Just tell me what went wrong. Let me understand. I don't get it." But underneath those sentences is a silent bargain they're hoping you'll accept. Don't tell it like it is. Tell it like I want it to sound. People who depend on reputation can't afford the kind of truth that forces them to confront their own patterns. They can't afford to admit that their good intentions didn't stop them from causing harm, that their charm didn't erase their irresponsibility, that their apologies didn't equal change. So they chase you, not because they value honesty, but because they're desperate to control how their story is told. They want to negotiate the ending of a plot they no longer get to write. But what they fail to understand is this: you don't owe them a gentle truth any more than you owed them silence when they were careless with your heart. If the truth stings, it's not because you spoke too sharply. It's because their actions left fingerprints they can't wash away. When you refuse to soften it, you're not being harsh, you're being real, and real is something they've never been able to handle. That's why they hope you'll make it easy, because they know they never made it fair. Number 12. They want your words because they can't handle your upgrade. When you start leveling up, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, even just in how you treat yourself, it rattles people who were comfortable with the older version of you. Not because they miss you, but because they miss the influence they had over you. Your upgrade isn't just progress, it's proof that their presence wasn't as essential as they convinced themselves it was. People get used to the version of you that fits their convenience, the version that excuses them, the version that stays despite the disrespect, the version that bends when they should have been the ones apologizing. When you stop doing those things, when you stop shrinking, when you stop tolerating what you never should have tolerated, you disrupt the entire system they relied on. So they chase your words not for closure, but for calibration. They want to hear something that tells them they still matter, that they still have a foothold, that your growth isn't actually leaving them behind. They're hoping you'll say something that keeps their ego intact. I still care. I still think of you. I'm not that different. They want nostalgia wrapped in reassurance. But growth can't be negotiated. It can't be paused. It can't be toned down to make someone comfortable. And when they realize you're not coming back to the version they could manage, they panic in ways they won't admit out loud. The truth is, upgrades expose people. When you stop accepting treatment you used to tolerate, it highlights how unacceptable it always was. When you walk with confidence you didn't have before, it reveals how much you carried alone. When you choose peace over chaos, it shows how often they brought the storm. They can't handle that reflection, so they reach for your words like a lifeline. Not because they want understanding, but because they want to rewrite the story so they don't look small next to the person you're becoming. But you don't owe them that comfort. Your upgrade isn't an insult to them. It's a gift to yourself. And anyone who can't handle that isn't hurt by your progress. They're exposed by it. When you stop giving them verbal access to your transformation, you take away the last thing they could misuse: interpretation. That's why they beg, because they can't stand being outgrown, and they can't stand admitting it either. Number 13. They want the truth. Because they can't handle the consequences of their lies. When people beg for the truth, it's usually not because they suddenly care about honesty. It's because their lies have finally started collapsing under their own weight. Lies have a strange lifespan. They hold up just long enough to feel safe, and then one day they begin to wobble, crack, and reveal everything they were meant to cover. And when that moment comes, they panic. They can't admit that their lies shaped the damage, so they chase the truth like it's a life raft, not to face it, but to control it. They want to hear it in a version they can negotiate, soften, or spin until it fits back into the story they've been telling themselves and everyone else. What they're actually asking is, "Can you please help me make this look less ugly than it really is?" But truth isn't a cosmetic. You can't apply it like makeup to hide what's underneath. Truth exposes, and exposure is what they fear more than consequences. Consequences can be apologized for. Exposure can't be undone. When you stop explaining, when you stop defending, when you stop smoothing their narrative for them, something unbearable happens for them. They have to own their actions without a translator. They can't blame miscommunication or misunderstanding because you're not giving them material to twist. They can't rewrite history because you're no longer participating in the rewrite. They can't plead innocence because their pattern speaks louder than any story they can invent. People like that depend on the illusion that they can always talk their way out of responsibility. They depend on people being patient, forgiving, unaware, or too kind to call them out directly. When you withdraw that privilege, they're left staring at the consequences they thought they could outrun forever. Their desperation is not for clarity, it's for escape. They want the truth delivered in a way that protects them from looking careless, selfish, disrespectful, or unworthy. But the truth does what it always does. It reveals. And when it reveals them, there's no apology, no explanation, no performance that can erase it. That's why they chase it. Not because they want honesty, because they can't survive it once it finally reaches them. Number 14. They beg for answers. Because losing access to you feels like losing access to a future. They thought they'd exploit. Some people stay close not because they value you, but because they value what being close to you gives them. Emotional comfort, social advantage, confidence, inspiration, validation, or even a sense of purpose. When you're gone, they don't just miss you. They lose a future they assumed they could take for granted. And that loss feels like betrayal, even though it's their own entitlement that built the fantasy. When they beg for answers, it's not curiosity, it's panic. They're suddenly forced to imagine a tomorrow without the benefits of your presence, without the stability you offered, without the way you made their chaos feel manageable. They thought you were part of their long-term plan, not because they planned with you, but because they assumed you'd always adjust around them. This is the part most people don't admit. Some relationships aren't loved, they're leveraged, not in a sinister mustache twirl way, but in a quiet, unconscious way. They make me feel seen. They keep me grounded. They help me grow. They get me through things. When those things stop being guaranteed, it feels like the ground tilting underneath them. So they plead, negotiate, demand clarity, ask for closure, call friends, write essays, invent misunderstandings, anything to reopen the door they closed with their own behavior. They want you to explain so they can rewrite their future back into existence, even if it means pretending they'll treat you better this time. But here's the truth they can't handle. You were never their future to exploit. You were a person, not a resource. Your presence wasn't a utility they could switch on whenever they felt lonely or lost. Your growth wasn't meant to be used as motivation for someone unwilling to grow themselves. When you withdraw access, you're not being cruel. You're correcting an imbalance they never noticed because they benefited from it. Their desperation isn't about love, loyalty, or regret. It's about losing a version of life where you carried more than your share, gave more than you received, and stayed longer than you should have. When you stop being available for exploitation, you force them to face a future they have to build on their own. And that is the truth they've always feared more than losing you. When you look at all of this honestly, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. When people chase you for the truth, for closure, for explanations, for access, it's almost never about healing. It's about comfort. It's about control. It's about desperately trying to hold on to a version of themselves that only existed because you tolerated what you shouldn't have. Your silence isn't cruelty. Your distance isn't revenge. Your growth isn't rejection. What scares them isn't losing you. It's losing the illusion you allowed them to live inside. Every time you stop explaining, stop justifying, stop shrinking, stop returning, you break a cycle they never wanted to admit existed. Your peace exposes what their excuses always tried to hide. Your progress rewrites a story they thought they were writing. Your absence forces a confrontation they avoided for years. And here's the part that matters most. None of this is your responsibility anymore. You don't owe people comfort for mistakes they made. You don't owe people access they abused. You don't owe people closure they refused to create. You don't owe people a version of yourself they never respected. The truth will always find its way to the surface, not because you speak, but because living honestly is louder than any argument. If this opened something in you, if it made you pause, if it made you feel seen, then it did its job. Thank you for listening, for thinking, for growing alongside this space. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment too. I read every single one, and your thoughts shape the next deep conversations we have here. Until next time, stay real, stay rising, and stay free. Stay awakened, chosen ones.